We have a matter at hand. A 15-year-old girl who genuinely believes that Davido Adeleke is her father, Davido himself, who says he has carried out multiple DNA tests, all of which came back negative, and based on that, believes she is not his daughter, and a woman who insists that Davido is the biological father of her child. When you put all these three positions together, the question many people have been asking is simple: who is telling the truth and who is lying? But what if the question is incomplete? What if all parties in this story are actually telling the truth from their own psychological standpoint? What if there is another explanation, a third explanation for the mystery we are seeing here? I know you've already seen videos about the situation. We've heard about the hot takes about what is happening and what is not happening. That's not what we're doing here. Here we're not trying to determine who is lying or who is telling the truth. We're trying to explore a psychological possibility, one that may have occurred even without those involved being fully aware. On this channel, we examine human psychology, and today we're going to dissect the psychology of this matter beyond what has been presented in the news. Now let's go down to the reason why we are having this conversation in the first place. This conversation, like those all over social media, was spurred by a post made by a child, the child who is at the center of this whole story. Davido Adeleke, who is 15 years old, made a public post that brought this matter back into public attention. This issue did not suddenly begin now, it has existed for years. But what changed is that, for the first time, the child herself chose to speak. I won't read her post word for word, but it's important to understand the nature of what she shared. The post was very emotional, but it was at the same time also respectful and measured. It did not read like an accusation, and it did not read like an attempt to provoke anyone. It read like a request. In that post, Davido asked that another DNA test be conducted. Based on the understanding she had been given, a DNA test was carried out once in the past, and according to her, that process was not properly handled. Because she believes that Davido Adeleke is her father, she asked calmly and respectfully for another test. Psychologically, this moment matters. At 15 years, a person is at a crucial stage of identity formation. Questions about origin, belonging, and lineage begin to take a deeper meaning. A person wants to find their identity, right? When a child reaches this stage and decides to speak publicly, the conversation shifts. It's no longer just adults debating past events. It becomes about a young person trying to understand who she is and where she comes from. That is why this story resurfaced now. Not because new facts suddenly appeared, but because the voice speaking changed. Once the child speaks, the issue becomes more emotional and it now carries a psychological weight. And that is the point we need to start from before looking at anything else. Before we analyze any adult response, we need to pause and properly understand the position of the child at the center of the story and the weight she's carrying. Davido Adeleke is 15 years old and she believes genuinely that Davido Adeleke is her father. When you go through her Instagram and you see her bio and everything, you see that one of the things she wrote there is Davido's first daughter. So apparently it's obvious she believes this is my father. This belief is not casual, it is not new, and it is not something that appeared overnight because of social media. She bears the surname Adeleke and she has carried that name for 15 whole years. Psychologically, a name is not just a label. For a child, it is an anchor. It is one of the earliest building blocks of identity. How they answer the question of who am I long before they ever ask it consciously. When a child grows up carrying a particular surname, hearing a particular narrative about their origins, and being introduced to the world under that identity, it becomes internalized as truth. That is what psychology refers to as identity anchoring. Children do not have the cognitive tools to independently verify claims about their lineage, paternity, or biology. Instead, these things are handed over to them. It is inherited from the people who are responsible for bringing them into this world. So those beliefs are repeated, reinforced, and emotionally validated over time. So when a child says, "This is who my father is," they are not making a calculated claim. They are expressing an identity that has already been formed. And this is important to state clearly. A child does not invent identity claims. They inherit them. which means that Anu's belief does not need to be judged as true or false at this stage. At this point, it only needs to be understood as sincere, and that sincerity is what makes the situation emotionally powerful and also psychologically complex. Now we move to the response. Davido replied publicly. He clearly stated that 5 DNA tests have already been conducted in the past, and according to him, all 5 tests returned negative. 3 of those tests were carried out at locations chosen by him, while 2 were done at facilities selected by the child's mother and her family. Based on all this, he stated clearly that he would not be conducting another DNA test. Now, one thing we need to do is not to isolate this response. Of course, reactions only make sense when viewed within behavioral patterns, not emotional moments. When you isolate this response, it begins to look like a man who is trying to deny, but historically, he has conducted various tests and all of them came back negative. So when you look at it in a larger context, you begin to see why the response came the way it did. Davido has always acknowledged and accepted his children when paternity has been established. That pattern matters. It shows that acceptance is not a problem to him. It is not foreign, nor is responsibility something he avoids when evidence confirms it. So when someone who has demonstrated a history of acceptance maintains rejection in one specific case with one specific child, despite the public attention, emotional appeal, and reputational costs, it signals something different from denial. That does not mean that the response he gave was right, because from my own standpoint, the response was somehow harsh, but we can understand it as a man who is frustrated at this point by a claim that has refused to go away despite, according to him, the DNA tests that has been conducted. But I still believe there were more calmer, kinder ways to have approached the issue, because this time it was the child that was making the request and she came forward respectfully and she was very emotional about it. This was just a child looking for her identity, so we can understand where she's coming from. Now, once Davido gave his response, Anu's mother also replied, and she said a lot of things. One of the main points she made is that the DNA test wasn't done 5 times. She says it was done only once. She also claimed that the process wasn't as transparent as it was made out to be, and that could have led to a false negative. She went on to talk about a lot of other things, how she's been treated, how she's been bullied, called names by Davido, and how that affected her. But one thing that comes through clearly is that she positioned herself as a woman who is very concerned about her daughter's mental health. This is not a woman who is trying to take her daughter through a harrowing experience. I understand that. Now we are seeing all of this for people who may not have followed the story from the beginning. So we're trying to create a sequence here so people can understand the natural progression of this story. I know some might have heard it before, but there are others who might not have. After everything she said, she made a request. She asked for a DNA test in the US. Since Davido is a US citizen, that makes sense, and that's actually the most important part for me. First, she said the DNA test was not done 5 times, but that's not the part we are focusing on, because if we start there, it will take us back to the question we are trying not to answer, which is who is lying and who is telling the truth. If Davido says 5 tests were done and she says only 1, we can't verify that because we are neither spiritualists nor mediums. There is no way to be sure. And trying to answer that would push us into making allegations that could end up being untrue, or it could make us biased without even knowing it. What we are trying to understand here is something different. We want to look at why Davido has consistently rejected this child, even though he has a history of accepting his children when paternity is proven. And we also want to understand why this woman is so convinced that Davido is the father of her child. If we step back and look at all of this together, a pattern starts to emerge. On one hand, we have a child who has grown up with a stable belief about her identity. She carries the name Adeleke, and she believes Davido is her father. That belief is very real to her. On the other hand, we have the mother. She's been insisting on this for 15 whole years. That's not child play. That kind of conviction is not easy to maintain. It costs emotionally, socially, and reputationally. People don't stick to a story like that for years unless they truly believe it. And then we have Davido. He has a history of accepting children when paternity is proven. He has done DNA tests repeatedly, and still he rejects this child. That's a consistent pattern from him. When you look at all these three together, one thing becomes clear. This is not the behavior of obvious liars. None of them seem to be trying to trick anyone. What we are seeing instead is a collision of internal truths. Each party is operating from their own certainty, what they genuinely believe to be real. And that's where it gets interesting. Because now we can start to ask, what could make these internal truths clash so strongly without anyone being dishonest? This is where we need to slow down and really think. So far we've looked at the child, the mother, and Davido, and what we're seeing is not chaos. What we're seeing is consistency on all sides for the past 15 years. Which brings us to a very uncomfortable question. What if something happened that night that was genuinely confusing, not just morally, but psychologically? Let's talk about the environment. According to the story, they met at a nightclub in Ibadan, and anyone who understands nightclub environments know that clubs are not controlled spaces. They are dark, they are loud, people are drinking, sometimes people are high, mind-altering substances are available. Judgment is not always sharp. Memory is not always clean. This is not an accusation in itself. This is just reality. Davido himself was not the Davido we know today. He wasn't that famous. He wasn't that recognizable. He wasn't moving with the kind of security and structure he has now. But he also had a reputation, even back then, of not moving alone. So let's consider a possibility. What if that night was not as simple as one man, one woman, one clear memory? What if there were other people around? What if alcohol was involved? What if mind-altering substances were involved? What if memory filled in gaps later? Psychology tells us something very important. Memory is not a video recording. Memory can be reconstructed, especially memories formed under stress, excitement, alcohol, or under the influence of mind-altering substances. So here's where the third explanation comes in. What if the mother genuinely believes she was with Davido that night? Because at the time, in that environment, that belief made sense to her. What if the child genuinely looks like an Adeleke because genetically she is an Adeleke, just not Davido's? That's a very hard idea to sit with, but psychologically it's not impossible, especially if there were other people present, especially if the environment was chaotic, and especially if years later, memory becomes certainty. This is how identity confusion happens. This is how belief solidifies. This is how a story can become truth in someone's mind, even if parts of it are inaccurate. And on the other side, this also explains Davido's position. If he truly knows who he was with and who he wasn't with, then repeated DNA tests would not feel like a denial to him. They will feel like confirmation. Yes, I'm not the father because I know I wasn't with this woman. So now we're not dealing with liars. We are dealing with conflicting internal realities. And that is one of the hardest psychological situations to resolve because everyone involved feels they are sincere. The woman genuinely believes I was with this guy. There's no other explanation. He is the biological father. Any negative DNA test must have been tampered with. And the man, knowing that I wasn't with this woman, it doesn't all make sense to him because this cannot be true. So this can create a situation where we have every party involved thinking they are telling the truth, even though factually some of the details might be inaccurate. At this point in the story, something else happened. A post was made by someone who claims to have personal contact with the people involved. And before we go any further, I think it's important that we read exactly what this person said, word for word, without changing anything. This is what he wrote. As someone who has met the mom, Ayo Labinjo, and have seen the kid, Anu, I feel in this situation, Ayo needs to tell her story. When I mean her story, what actually happened? I've heard fragments of it from people who are mutuals. She owes it to her kid. And when I say the story, I don't mean the Kemi Olunloyo version or the story they are telling her to say, the exact story of what actually happened that day. The child looks like an Adeleke, no doubt. Even though Davido is easy to pin things on for obvious reasons, can the DNA be done on others? Every person she met in that time frame. I don't want to say more than this. Maybe we can find an answer. Maybe we can get an answer for the kid. My best wishes to all involved. That is everything he said, nothing added, nothing removed. Now let's slow down here. Let's look at this carefully. We are looking at it as another person who actually believes in what we think might have happened, or maybe just sees things differently. The fact that he says, "Tell the story," already tells us there's more involved in this situation. This is not as simple as the social media headlines make it out to be. There are things happening behind the scenes, behind closed doors, that we simply do not know right now. But even though we don't know the full story, this post still gives life to the thesis we are exploring. There might have been more people or factors involved in this story. From what we see, this person appears to be close to the situation. He has met the mother, he has seen the child, and he has heard fragments from mutual people. That alone suggests he is somewhere near the story, not completely outside of it. Now, pay attention to how he phrases things. He says, "The child looks like an Adeleke, no doubt." Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't accuse anyone. He doesn't specify anyone else. He's hinting, trying to say something without saying it plainly. On the internet, especially with sensitive matters, people are careful with language. You don't just come out and make claims or accusations openly. But if you read his words closely, he's trying to convey an idea to the reader without fully spelling it out. He also asks, can the DNA be done on others? Every person she met in that time frame. Again, not a claim, not a judgment, just a question. One that opens the door to possibilities beyond the surface story. We're not saying what we don't know, but based on everything we have seen so far. The mother's long-term conviction, the father's consistent rejection of this child, and now this third-party voice, we can begin to understand how multiple internal truths can exist at the same time. They may not all be factually correct, but they are truths in the minds of those involved. So we've come to a point where we are proposing a thesis that, okay, both of them might actually be right in their own minds, but they might not be factually right. So now we have wrapped up this discussion. Here's the thing we have to remember. In human psychology, just because someone is sincere doesn't mean they are always accurate. And just because there is evidence doesn't automatically erase someone's belief. People experience events differently and they remember differently as well. And sometimes their truths exist in their own minds, even if they don't factually match reality. What we have seen here is not about who is lying or telling the truth. It's about understanding why each person believes what they believe, why the mother is so convinced, why the father is so sure, and why the child carries that belief as part of her identity. As analysts, we're not judges. We don't declare winners or losers. What we do is look, observe, and try to understand the psychology behind these actions and beliefs. So now that we have wrapped all of this up, I still need to hear your opinion. One thing we don't do here is to try to act like we know it all. We simply propose a thesis of what we think might actually have happened based on all that has been happening, the strong conviction from all parties. But at the same time, I would like my audience to give me their own opinions on what they think is actually happening. The thing is, some people tend to become biased. People who are Davido lovers will say the woman is a liar, she doesn't know what she's saying. People who are empathetic towards the woman's situation will say that Davido is a liar, he doesn't want to claim responsibility for the child. Different opinions flying here and there. But what is important is for us to be logical thinkers. That is why in this channel, we don't just tell the surface story or gossip. So that is what I want. I want people to give me their opinions. What do you think? Do you think the video is lying, or do you think the woman is lying? Or do you believe that this, our thesis, actually has some form of truth to it? So let me know your thoughts in the comment section. And while you're doing that, do not forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share this video.